in the second video on unclear or garbled reasoning. Here I want to talk about the second example. So let me read through this example first, then we can talk about it. So 3, Euthyphro believes that the pious is being loved only because it is pious, not because it is being loved. However, Socrates' earlier questioning logically deduced the result of a passive affection, such as being loved, is caused by an agent acting on a patient. For instance, the passive affection of being God-loved is a result of all the gods, the agent loving an object, the patient. Euthyphro agrees that an agent, the gods acting on the patient object X, results in a passive affection of being God-loved. 7, relative to the pious, all the gods would be the agent and the pious would be the patient. This would result in the passive affection of being God-loved. 8, thus Euthyphro's claim of the pious being God-loved because it is pious switches the agent-patient relationship, allowing the pious to be the passive affection and the cause, the agent of piety. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, let's take it one sentence at a time. So starting with 3, Euthyphro believes that the pious is being loved only because it is pious, not because it is being loved. Well, here we sort of have a similar problem to the problem that we had up in the first example, in that, well, if it were being loved because it is being loved, that would have the same problem as up here, right? That it's loved is loved because it is loved, being loved because it is being loved. I mean, that's vacuous. It doesn't tell us anything. And so what's really important about the content of 3 is this other part, right? So Euthyphro believes that the pious is being loved because it is pious, right? So it's the piety that's causing the loving. Right? So it's the piety that causes the loving. That's the important part. And then this other part, not because it is being loved, I mean, that's not really adding anything here, or it's not clearly adding anything. So it'd be better if the author just said, Euthyphro believes that the pious is being loved because it is pious. Moving on. However, Socrates' earlier questioning logically deduced the result of a passive affection, such as being God-loved, is caused by an agent acting on a patient. How can we fix this sentence? Well, here, the beginning is really verbose. I mean, there's a lot of words here, and it's not so clear what it means to logically deduce a result, etc., through questioning, right? I mean, all the author really means is that Socrates showed that a passive affection, such as being God-loved, is caused by an agent acting on a patient. And so that would be a better way to say this. So how about, however, Socrates showed, let's cross all this out. However, Socrates showed a passive affection, such as being God-loved, is caused by an agent acting on a patient. Okay, good. Moving on. 5, for instance, the passive affection of being God-loved is a result of all the gods, the agent, loving an object, the patient. Okay, so this looks like it's supposed to be an example of this general principle, right, that Socrates showed. And the God loved is the effect of the gods, the agent, loving the God loved, the patient. Okay. Euthyphro agrees that an agent the God loves acting on the patient, object X, results in a passive affection of being God loved. Well, I mean, okay, that reports Euthyphro's agreement here, and that's new. But otherwise, I mean, that we have an agent, the gods acting on a patient, object X, results in the passive affection of being God loved. That, in a way, just repeats what was going on in sentence 5. And so this doesn't really add all that much. I mean, you might think, well, this is an instance of the general phenomenon, but this was already an instance, right? And so it's really not clear what 6 adds. I mean, we could really just cut 6. It's not saying much more than was already there in 5. 7, relative to the pious, all the gods would be the agent, and the pious would be the patient. This would result in the passive affection of being God loved. So there again, well, okay, it's the gods loving the thing, the pious thing, the patient, and that's what makes the pious thing, the patient, God loved, right? So it's the gods loving that makes the thing God loved. I mean, that again is restating what's happening up in 5, and in sort of a less clear way. I mean, it's sort of introducing the notion of piety, where you might think it's the piety that's causing the gods to love the pious thing, not the gods loving that's causing the thing to be pious, right? And so 7 is sort of just restating the point that was already there in 5 in a less clear way. And so again, you know, it just doesn't seem like it's adding to the argument in question. So we don't need it. Okay, but what about 8? Well, thus Euthyphro's claim of the pious being God loved because it is pious switches the agent-patient relationship, allowing the pious to be the passive affection and the cause, the agent of piety. Well, here, there's a lot going on, right? I mean, there's too much going on, right? So without saying so, I mean, this in a way jumps back to the claim of 3, but it hasn't told us that it's jumping back to the claim of 3, right? Where the claim of 3 was that Euthyphro believes that the pious is being loved because it's pious, right? So the pious is what's causing the loving. And so it's doing that in the first half, right? So Euthyphro's claim of the pious being God loved because it is pious, right? So there, it's the piousness that's causing the gods loving in this first part. So we're jumping back to the claim of 3 without saying so. And then we're combining that with the ideas of 5, 6, and 7 in the second part. But we're sort of leaving this vague because we're talking about, you know, switching the agent-patient relationship. But then it's like, well, how are we switching them, right? You know, one thing that could help here is, well, 3 sort of comes out of the blue. I mean, it's not clear why we're introducing this claim up here. It would be more, you know, 8 would follow more naturally if 3 had been introduced later on, maybe. But that then would also mean, well, we don't even need this whole first half. And now it's in the second half that we really get, you know, this is where new stuff is happening. But it's not clear from this what the contradiction is supposed to be, right? I mean, it's sort of in there if you dig really hard and think really hard about it, right? You know, this is the crucial move, but it needed more development, right? And it needed at least 2, maybe 3 sentences of its own. Furthermore, I mean, you know, if we go back to the general principle of 4, we haven't gotten any examples that establish it. So really, we should have had some examples. That would have helped. And really, I mean, here, you know, we're only getting the explanatory relationship. We're not getting the other side of the general principle. You know, that the affection, the being carried, say, does not explain the carrying, right? So we're only really getting part of the general principle here in 5, and we're getting that restated again and again, but really we need both sides. And so that should have been introduced with examples, and then we should have gotten both sides of the general principle. And then we should have gotten this controversial claim of Euthyphro's that the pious is being loved only because it's pious. And then we get an instance of the general principle, both sides of it. And it's through that that we then can get the contradiction. And then that should all be laid out, more explicitly. And so you can see how in this example, the reasoning is really, really quite garbled. I mean, there are some thoughts that are on the right track here, but they're buried under the surface. They're not there. They're not being explained fully by the author. Okay, see you in the next video.